with two great patriots. I can't think of two greater patriots, in fact, than Bob Moses and Reverend Barber, who've come to be with us today. And I want to introduce both of them and then get right into our discussion today, which focuses on the question of whether the rebellion in the streets by Black Lives Matter and the young generation, whether the COVID-19 crisis and all of the failed state crises associated with the current administration, whether all of that sets the table for a third Reconstruction. The first one, of course, being in the wake of the Civil War. It lasted for 12 years before it was undone by white supremacy and racism. And then it came back again in the early 1960s. And if there's one person who's identified with the coming of the second Reconstruction, it would be Bob Moses, who's here today. That lasted remarkably for perhaps more than a decade, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, a real interracial push for change in the country. And it has been undone by successive right-wing Supreme Courts and a Southern strategy that our guest will describe to you, culminating in the freakish, cartoonish figure of Donald Trump, who sees white supremacists marching down the street and sees very fine people and retweets one of his supporters who actually is yelling white power, and he retweeted that a few days ago. So the question is whether we're in a different political context now, because everything that we've been through over the last 6 or 7 weeks, what needs to happen? What are the elements and the ingredients of using this as an opportunity to have a real transformation in the country? There's nobody better than these two people in America to talk about it. I'm going to quickly introduce them, starting with Bob Moses. It's hard for me to tell you exactly what Bob Moses means to me, because my father loved him very much, and I inherited my love of Bob Moses from my father. But Bob Moses is a mathematician, he's a philosopher, he's a teacher in the deepest sense, he's an activist, and he's a luminous force for good in the world. And I can't steal the whole story from him of his life, but you can read about it in his remarkable book called Radical Equations, which describes his journey from the civil rights movement in the 1960s to his creation of the Algebra Project today. But he tells the story of how he was a philosophy student at Harvard in 1960, and the sit-ins by students throughout the South began to break out. And he said he saw a picture on the cover of the New York Times of some of these sit-ins. Please mute your phones, whoever said that, mute your, but he saw these pictures of students sitting in, and what he said was, they looked the way that I felt, and he knew that he had to go south. And he moved to Mississippi, and he met a guy there by the name of Amzie Moore, who was the president of the local NAACP. Bob records how he thought he would be working in desegregation campaigns related to sit-ins in restaurants and department stores and stuff like that. But actually, what Amzie Moore said to him was, do you know that you're sitting in a 2/3 African-American congressional district and no one can vote? And Bob Moses there realized that, like, there was an iron curtain in Europe, there was a cotton curtain in America, and that the system of political white supremacy had been restored. And he set about tearing that down through voter registration, the extraordinarily dangerous and patient work of registering people to vote. And his story from Mississippi is the story of America in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, with Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and Dr. King, and the 1964 Democratic National Convention, and building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So Bob Moses has extraordinary insight into the current situation. So we've got him, but we also have the Reverend William Barber with us today, who is a remarkable, once-in-a-generation political organizer, leader, orator, change agent. And his main thing is he's a minister. He's a member of the National Board of the NAACP and chair of its Legislative Political Action Committee. He led regular Moral Monday protests in North Carolina, which transformed the politics of that critical state. He founded Repairers of the Breach and launched the Poor People's Campaign, which we got to participate in a couple weekends ago, a national call for moral revival. And he will have some essential things to say. So Reverend Barber, we're going to start with you. I turn it over to you. What is your reaction? You wrote a book with this title, presciently, in a visionary way in 2016, called The Third Reconstruction. Are we ready for it? What are the elements and what are the ingredients? The floor is yours. And unmute, if you can unmute your, Reverend Barber, can you hit your unmute?
Thank you so much, Congressman, and thank you for allowing me to share with Brother Moses, who's such a hero and thought leader for so many of us. Thank you for allowing me to have a little something to do with these young people. I really want to hear from them because they're so brilliant in this moment and always have been. And also, I want to greet you on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign National Call for Moral Revival. Gathering just 2 weeks ago had 2.5 million people just on Facebook Live alone. Can you hear me well?
We got you.
Right. And we presented a major platform. The teenagers and others that are there can go to www.breachrepairs.org, www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, and get the audit, the budget, the platform of this multiracial, intergenerational coalition that is building and has been building for 3 years. I want to make a few, as they say in the law, I want to stipulate a few statements, and then I want to come back and just make the case. One is I do think we are in the birth pains of a third Reconstruction, and I think that's why we're seeing such a pushback, because there's an attempt by extremists to keep it from happening. Number two, I want to certainly stipulate that we have to stop saying just Donald Trump. McConnell and the extremists in the Senate who continue to lead with an attitude of the white Southern strategy are as dangerous or more dangerous than Trump, because we don't pay attention to them, like what they're doing to the courts, like the fact that just last week, McConnell had sat on fixing the Voting Rights Act for 7 years. When Strom Thurmond led what do they call it? When he wouldn't allow the Civil Rights Act of 1957 to come up for a filibuster for 1 day, we called him a white supremacist. McConnell has blocked the Voting Rights Act from even being fixed for 7 straight years, over 2,500 days. And that is, in fact, a form of major racism, because all of the other stuff we see, many of the people that are getting elected to Congress and senators and the governors are not because they're winning the majority of the votes, it's because of the voter suppression. And then lastly, I want to say this can be a third Reconstruction if we also recognize that what we see in the streets in reaction to George Floyd is not just about George Floyd. And if it is just about George Floyd, like Rosa Parks, we need to expand it, as she did when Emmett Till was killed. She didn't just want the killers of Emmett Till to be dealt with. She said, let's go after Jim Crow itself, which is why on August 28th, you also have the March on Washington, because that's the anniversary of the day of the death of Emmett Till. And this can be a third Reconstruction if Democrats in particular act like it is a third Reconstruction and recognize this moment it can be a third Reconstruction if our asks are not too small, and if we stop looking for one piece of legislation and think we have dealt with racism. And surely, if we don't get caught up in spectacle and think just a flag coming down in Mississippi or a statue in North Carolina is a fundamental shift in policy, because the governor of Mississippi brought the flag down because of the pressures by business and the athletes the other day, but then turned around that night and vetoed 2 bills that would help Black people and poor people. So those are some things I want to stipulate. And then I want to say is, in this moment we're in, I don't think we can see a way forward without understanding how we got here. And Princeton historian Neil Irvin Painter has named a pattern we are witnessing in a way that makes sense to me. She calls it call and response. She says, what we are seeing right now is the iconography of a tragically traditional American call and response. The call is a challenge to the status quo of white people on top. The response is outbreaks of meanness and many merely vile, embracing rhetorical weapons, many murderers taking up physical weapons. The bloody history of lynching with its festive mobs and souvenir postcards and body parts bristles with personal provocations to the racial status quo. In other words, Nell Painter is saying what we are seeing now, we have always seen in America. First off, you talk about that first Reconstruction in the 19th century that came after the Civil War. What happened? Fusion coalitions, poor white folk and black folk, freedmen, found themselves together after the end of the Civil War, and they decided to reconstruct the South, knowing if they reconstruct the South, they could reconstruct the nation. And by 1868, every Southern legislature was led by a black-white fusion coalition. Some of those legislators were predominantly black. Now, in my state, in North Carolina, for instance, a black and white preacher got together and they helped rewrite the Constitution. One of them was named J.W. Hood, the former president of Livingstone College. And they wrote this, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons, notice, in 1800, they didn't say men. After the Civil War, they said all persons are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, watch this, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labors. They put that in there. They upped, if you will, the Declaration of Independence, made it the opening of the North Carolina Constitution, and they made education a constitutional right, and not just any kind of education. They made a basic, fundamental, quality education a constitutional right for every person, not just every child, in 1868. They guaranteed voting rights in 1868. They passed equal protection under the law in 1868 in a state constitution before those things were even in a federal constitution. And this was happening all over the South. During that Reconstruction, you got the 13th Amendment, and please let folks know Juneteenth is not when slavery ended. It's December 6th, 1965, when it was finally ratified by the state. December 6th, 13th Amendment, then you get the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, which protects women, protects black people, protects handicapped people, protects anybody whose rights are violated under the Constitution. The 15th Amendment, voting rights, 1875, the Civil Rights Act that made it a felony to discriminate in 1875. That's why King, when he was at the March on Washington in 1963, said 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. He was thinking about all the things that had been passed 100 years earlier. And every state had in the South had these fusion coalitions. But then there was a violent backlash. 1872, the KKK, attacking white people first. White people working with black people were the first target of the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. Then you get an attack on voting rights, an attack on civil rights, an attack on taxes. Cutting taxes became a mantra to deconstruct Reconstruction. Then you had violence against black people and other sympathizers of the Reconstruction. 1876, you get an election. In that election, the presidential candidate loses the popular vote. Think about this, loses the popular vote. He's given the Electoral College in a way that is questionable because he promises to deconstruct Reconstruction and hand over the courts to the extremists. And by 1883, the 1875 Civil Rights Act is overturned. By 1896, you have Plessy versus Ferguson. 1898, you have the Wilmington riots where 3% of the city was killed. Elected officials, black and white elected officials, were either killed or run out of town. And by 1901, you have black people being lynched on an average of 1 per day. And then you had in the 1920s, a resurgence of the Klan, and they added immigrants, Catholics, and unruly women to its target, that Jim Crow politicians formed alliances with Wall Street. That's why the first Reconstruction was ended. Then you had the second Reconstruction that Barber, so of course, my father and others were a part of. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. We call it the Civil Rights Movement. But it really was about a new fusion coalition and young folk and others coming together, civil rights and labor and immigrants and women and poor folks of every shade. Dr. King, remember, was killed. Remember, the reconstructions in this country have never just stopped. They were assassinated. They were murdered. They never just quit. That work was never finished. Poor People's Campaign in 1967, 68 was assassinated. But in the middle of this, you get the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, you get the coming together of the peace movement and the civil rights movement. You get Dr. King raising those three things, militarism, poverty, and racism together, saying you can't address them separately. You get young folk, the young folk in SNCC that will not back up, will not just accept just anything. But then there was a backlash, and the backlash against them was something called the White Southern Strategy. And the White Southern Strategy says, number one, we are going to turn the Republican Party into the party of white people in the South. Number two, we're going to find a way to talk about race without sounding racist. Without sounding racist. The campaign manager of George Bush actually said, he said, we knew that up until about 1950, the 1960s, all you had to do to win in the South was say the word. Now, I want your folk to hear this. This is what they said. He said, if you said nigger, 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 you could win. But by 1962, 63, you couldn't say that anymore the same way. So we had to change the language. So he said, we changed the language to say states' rights. Tax cuts, forced busing. Those terms became code words along with many others. And they fueled this undercut of the Southern strategy. And the goal of that Southern strategy was to take over first the 13 former Confederate states, because they knew if you control them, you control 168 plus electoral votes. But they also had learned from George Wallace, because George Wallace won in Indiana when he ran for president. He almost won in Maryland. They learned that this same strategy could be played in the North and among the various ethnic enclaves. If you listen to George Wallace's 1968 speech in Madison Square Garden, Google it, it sounds just like Donald Trump today. Almost verbatim to him saying, kick him out of here. He ought to be beat up anyway for coming in here protesting during my speech. So the reality is, what I want James wanted to say is that these patterns happen. You have advancements in voting rights, advancements in economic rights, advancement in civil rights, and then there's always this backlash. And the backlash always occurs in a kind of simultaneously attack on voting rights, cutting taxes, push for law and order, violent attacks of the police, and then candidates that win using divisive rhetoric, but also promising to make things economically better for certain people. Those five things, whenever they are lining up, they are either to stop a reconstruction or to stop what has been reconstructed and to turn it around. And so here's the point. All of the negatives we see are the signs that we are ripe for a third reconstruction. That it's either a sign that we're in the beginnings of a reconstruction, or it's a sign that it's deep and folk want to stop it. But regardless of what it is, yes, I believe we're in the birth pains of a third reconstruction. And it did not just happen when that man lynched and strangled George Floyd. That was a spark. But you miss what's really going on in this moment if you do not look at all of the movements that have been happening and how that spark kind of brought them together. In some ways, when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," he became shorthand for so many people's lives. Poor folk that can't breathe because 700 of poor people are dying every day from poverty. Workers that can't breathe because they're being forced to go into lethal jobs in the middle of a pandemic. People that are dying in hospitals needlessly. 70% of the folk have died needlessly. What is probably their last breath? I can't breathe. This I can't breathe is kind of the suffocation that's going on because of all of the extremism that is being caused when we see the suffocation of voting rights, the suffocation of labor rights, the suffocation of fighting for a new green economy, the suffocation of the poor. And what we see in the street now is the democracy trying to breathe. Because really what a reconstruction is, it's about breathing. It's about justice and love and equal protection under the law and providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare, taking on life and refusing to die and refusing to be deconstructed and torn apart. And so, yes, and the young folk on this video have to be the carriers of this, watch this, with those of us who are yet alive. It is a false dichotomy to pit the elderly against the young. In my Bible, as I close, when the Holy Spirit breathed on us, even in the Jewish tradition, it talks about the Spirit as ruach, air, wind, breath. When the Spirit breathes, it says, your sons and daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall have vision, your young people will be prepared for war or for battle. So it's all of us together, everybody in, nobody out. Somebody's hurting our people and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
Reverend Barber, thank you for your magnificent vision and your leadership and for sharing with us today. Let's come to Bob Moses. And Bob, the floor is yours now before we open it up to questions from the fellows.
Okay. So I thought I would start with a story. And it happened in the spring of 1963. So Kennedy is still president. Bobby Kennedy is your attorney general. Burke Marshall is the assistant attorney general for civil rights. And John Doe is his chief staff person. I was at that time in charge of SNCC, Mississippi Voter Registration Insurgency. And we had a meeting in Greenwood with the person, Randolph Blackwell, who came down from Atlanta, and the Voter Education Project. So they were funneling resources and money through the Voter Education Project, which was under the wing of the Southern Regional Council, which was white moderates and blacks in the South, right? So leaving the meeting, we were grease-gunned. A grease gun kind of operates like a machine gun. And it ripped holes in the side of the car, blasted out all the windows. And there were three of us in the front. Jimmy Travis, who was SNCC field secretary, was driving. I was in the middle and Randolph Blackwell was on the other side. Jimmy cried out, "I'm hit." And the car veered off into the ditch. I hit the brakes, grabbed the wheel, came to a stop. After that happened, SNCC converged on Greenville to meet and to decide what should we do in response. So the one thing we could do was to converge on Greenwood. And so we did. We brought all of our field secretaries in Mississippi to Greenwood. And it just so happened that the LaFleur County officials, Greenwood is in LaFleur County, had cut out the federal commodities to the sharecroppers. And so we took that as an opportunity and raised food in Chicago. Dick Gregory flew plane loads of food down to Chicago. And we told the people up front, well, look, the reason you don't have your commodities is because of the politics. So if you want any of this food, you have to go down and participate. You have to register, try to register to vote. So we got hundreds of people lining up at the church and going down to register. And then the city decided to arrest all the SNCC field secretaries. So there were about 8 or 9 of us. When they did that, Burke, the Assistant Attorney General, stepped in and filed suit against the city and had our cases removed to the Federal District Court in Greenville. And we bust over sharecroppers from Greenwood. Burke sent down John Doerr to be our lawyer. I was on the witness stand with Federal District Judge Clayton, who just had one question. He wanted to know, why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? So there you have the whole thing in a nutshell: sharecropper illiteracy, sharecropper education, the caste system that was run in Mississippi. All of that was coming to a head around the simple idea of taking somebody down to register to vote. So I began to think about this issue of sharecropper education. It's an education that you're pre-assigned work. You get at best the education for which you've been pre-assigned. And that had been going on now in Mississippi since at least Plessy in 1896, as Reverend Barber mentioned, right? And was endemic across the whole South in terms of the education assigned to people, children who were destined to become either sharecroppers or work the mines. So the issue of sharecropper education is before us. It came up in the court case in Rodriguez in 1968. Mexican-American kids marched out of their school in San Antonio and complained about the building and the teachers and everything. And the mothers took it to court, and in 1971, it reached the Supreme Court. Justice Powell was the chief judge. And he said, look, you can't come to the federal court system for relief on these equity issues because there is no substantive constitutional right to an education. The key word being substantive, right? And so across the country, there are 45 cases in 45 states. Reverend Barber, I don't know what the situation is in North Carolina, which took up this idea about education and have left it to the states really to decide whether or not they want to do anything about education. So for example, in New York State, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity around the turn of the century filed suit to get more resources to the kids in New York City. And you had a federal district judge who said yes. And he signed off and it went up the ladder. Pataki was governor. He said, no, we need to hear this before a panel of, a 3-judge panel of the state. And the 3-judge panel said no. And the reason is, the court has already decided that there is no federal right to an education. That's the Rodriguez case. And so it's left to the state constitution of New York. And what does it say? Well, it says you have to educate the young people so they can at least serve on juries and vote. And then they said, an 8th grade education is enough to do that. New York City is already doing that. Anybody who graduates from high school in New York can do that. So there's no need for more money. And then one of the judges said, look, there are a lot of low-paying jobs out here. So who is going to actually work those low-paying jobs, and what kind of education do they need? So that was the 21st century version of sharecropper education, which is operating across the whole country because the planet has moved on from industrial technology to information age technology. The requirements of the 20th century, what the judge was thinking about when he said, why are you taking illiterates? He was thinking about reading and writing. He had no notion that there was a quantitative literacy that needed to be on the table. But the information age technology puts quantitative literacy on the table, right? In the same way as reading and writing were on the table in the last century. Now, if you have a safety net, you're okay. But if you don't have a safety net, then you're out here in the streets and you're the subject of mass incarceration. So the mass incarceration that we see here, I mean, if you stop and think about it, right, in the first constitutional era, from the 1787 down to 1865 era, there were no Africans in jail. They weren't locking up Africans and putting them in jail. Africans weren't citizens, right? Africans belonged to people. Africans were property of people. And so if you wanted to do something about an African who you thought did something, you went to the person who owned them, right? And you got help from the federal government to do that. So there was no question then of what Reverend Barber was talking about, of states' rights. It was the rights of the property owner, right? And so the federal government could organize a posse after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act law, right? And go into a state, regardless of what the state said, and rescue somebody's property and take them back, right, to their owner, right? So the second constitutional era, you have to look up Circular 3591. So those of you who are out there on your own, you can just Google it, Circular 3591, right? And what comes up is a proclamation by the Attorney General of the United States, Biddle, right? In December 1941, under President Roosevelt. December 12th, to be exact, 5 days after Pearl Harbor. And what does he say? He says to every state prosecuting attorney, forget about prosecuting vagrancy, right? And sending young Black kids to jail for vagrancy into the mines. You need to prosecute for involuntary servitude or slavery. That's what's been going on. Tens and tens of thousands of young Black men have been rounded up locally under these laws. And it needs to come to a stop because we need young Black men now to fight this war, right? And so in that second constitutional era, Black men were needed, right? And they were used. We don't need them anymore. So we lock them up. So we have this mass incarceration. You're not going to educate them, right? They're part of the caste system. It's been in place for over 100 years. And we have no intention, right, of actually changing how we educate the young people. And now I'm not just talking about young Black people. Yes, it's young Black people. But what's happened is that, you know, young Black people are just the canary in the mines, right? And so this problem of growing up in the 21st century with a 20th century education, right, is infecting the whole population that doesn't have, some safety nets or people, connections that they can do something about, right? So what we have latched onto and what's encouraging is this Detroit decision, right? The Public Policy Institute in LA, right, filed a suit in Detroit, and a federal appeals court, a 3-judge panel, right, that ruled that there is a constitutional right to a basic minimum education, right? So now this is the first time we've had at the level of the Constitution a little piece of the federal judiciary, which is saying that there is such a thing as a constitutional right to an education. And Reverend Barber, as he pointed out, it was the Supreme Court and the Roberts Court, which took us back, right? It's the same thing that happened after Reconstruction with the courts in 1883 and 1896. So, yes, go ahead.
Bob, can I just interrupt for 1 second? Because I know Reverend Barber's got to go, and I want you to resume in just a moment, but I just want to get in one question for him that came from Democracy Summer Fellow Angela Xiong. And she says, what makes some peaceful protests like the March on Washington successful, while others like Occupy Wall Street are not so much? How do you understand that?
Well, first of all, I want to just lovingly say I wouldn't call it peaceful. I think that's some tricky language. Nonviolent protests, because they call Bob Moses and folk violent, and they weren't even violent. They called them disrupting the peace. We got to be careful of this language. That's political language. Politics say we want you to have peaceful protests as opposed to it's nonviolent versus violent protests. What makes it also successful is there was a broad agenda. The March on Washington was about jobs and justice. It was about transformation. It was also sending people back to work. It also was not rooted in a personality. Dr. King didn't just say, come hear me speak. There were 600 communities that were engaged in protest around the country or more. People came from organizing to DC to present a common front and then went back. And it was clearly rooted. And they also had a level of determination. Remember, it wasn't but 17 days later that 4 girls got blown up in a Birmingham jail, which actually backfired to some degree because that made more young folks say, black and white, we're going to the South now. Bob can tell that story better than I can. They said, you kill 4 of us, we're gonna get a Voting Rights Act out of this. We're gonna get a Civil Rights Act out of this. So people looked at, they didn't see racism as a spectacle issue. They saw it as a systemic issue. And so right now, one of the keys is we're saying in the Poor People's Campaign, there are 5 systemic issues we have to address simultaneously. Systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And when we address those, we have to look at them deeply. Systemic racism, is interesting to hear Bob talk, because in the Poor People's Campaign, systemic racism, we start with voter suppression. The next one is underfunding and resegregation of public schools. The next one is mass incarceration. The next one is the mistreatment of immigrants. The next one is the constant hit on things that are done to First Nation indigenous people. That's racism. Then we deal with police violence too, but it's not that alone. Then number 2, poverty is there 140 million people poor and low wealth in this country, 43% of the nation, 62 million people that work every day without a living wage. Ecological devastation is 4 million people that get up every morning, can buy unleaded gas, can buy unleaded water, so forth and so on. The war economy is 54 cents of every discretionary dollar going into war economy and to a corporate militarization rather than going into education, healthcare. Less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar from the federal government goes to education, infrastructure, and healthcare. And so when you look at these issues, you hear me, that it's a policy, it's policy. We have to be very careful right now in this moment because there are too many people that want to see racism as, first of all, separate from the issue of poverty, but also as a spectacle issue. And the last thing I would say to that a young person is that when we look at, for instance, right now, there are two things I want to mention. We hear a lot of talk about statues, flags, and now there's a big push to make Juneteenth a holiday. I don't necessarily agree with that. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I'm not against the holiday per se, but let's say, why not use Juneteenth and call for a election as a holiday, or December 6th as a holiday? But more important, if you make it so, then let's have policies that are going to be passed, like making education fully a constitutional right, like restoring fully the Voting Rights Act and expanding it, like making living wages a mandate, because if you make living wages a mandate, 54% of all African Americans make less than a living wage. If you raise the living wage to $15 an hour, you automatically bring 39 million people out of healthcare. Out of poverty. Let's make healthcare a constitutional right, not just like it is all around the world. Let's make it a constitution, or in other places throughout the world, because those things matter. And if you look back through history, I was thinking as Bob was talking, the reason they cut taxes in the first Reconstruction, they did not want to fund education. They also had to stop Reconstruction because the Southern states from the Fusion Coalition were making education a constitutional right. And if they had kept on, they would have got it all the way to the federal. And if you want to undermine the people, you keep them uneducated and incarcerated. The reality is, there's a book entitled, Bob, you may know it, called The Incarcerated God. And inside that book, a guy says, why did this particular state put more money in incarceration and education? The response is, we can't live like we want to live if everybody is around us. We have to put some people in the ghetto, but the ghettos fill up, and we have to find another place to put them. That's actually a quote from an education official back in the 1990s, actually. Then lastly, on this voting piece, Trump won by 102,000 votes in 3 states. Well, I don't really say he won. He won in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There were 2.1 million poor and low wealth people already registered in those states that did not vote. There were 100 million people that didn't vote in 2016. In the South, 20 million plus poor and low wealth white, Black, and Latino people did not vote. When I talk to them in places like Kentucky, I'm talking about in the hollows of Kentucky, up in Appalachia, and ask them, why did you vote for Trump? They say, we didn't vote for Trump. Most people under 40,000 did vote for Trump. I said, well, why didn't you vote? They say, because nobody comes back and talks to us. And nobody talks about our issues. Nobody calls our name. Nobody talks about the poor and low wealth. Nobody talks about making sure poor folk, regardless of their color, have quality education, whether it's in the mountains of Appalachia or the Delta of Mississippi, which is why we now have people from the mountains of Kentucky working with people from the Delta of Mississippi. And we were able to see last year, 3 counties in Kentucky, 3 predominantly white Trump counties turn in the last gubernatorial election. But we spent 2 years up there. As Bob said, we took a pattern from SNCC. You go among the people. And we spent 2 or 3 years up there organizing and talking with folk, the Hatfields and the McCoys, and showing them the connection between systemic racism and their own poverty. And those folk turned. We never endorsed the Democratic candidate, but they turned and they voted, and Kentucky got a new governor. So I close with this. Yes, we must have a 3rd Reconstruction. Yes, I believe we're in the birth pains of it, but we need everybody to get it. And we need to set our visions loose from this neoliberalism that says all you got to do is take care of the middle class and the wealthy and everything is fine. And we need to find a way to see. You saw what Bob was doing. He was making that connection between sharecropper education, incarceration. So we got to make the connections and stop siloing issues. Deal with them all at one time: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, And then I like to include the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, which tries to consecrate those very things that are irreligious and really have no standing in our Constitution and no standing in our deepest religious tradition. Now, I wish I could stay. I got to go make this presentation because I want to hear the rest of what Bob is saying. And Bob, I hope we can get together soon on video. So I'm going to get the numbers from Jamie.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will connect you guys. Reverend Barber, we're sending you love and strength, and Democracy Summer is with you all the way, okay? Whatever you need from us.
www.june2020.org for the young people. They can watch the Mass Poor People's Assembly on that link, www.june2020.org.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Yay, Reverend Barber. All right, Bob, we're coming back to you now for you to finish up, and then we'll open it up to the kids again.
So to finish up, there's so much ground to cover. I would like the young people to think about a really difficult and important task that their generation has to at least have a really deep conversation about, and that's the Constitution. We have a Constitution that has led us down this path, and we refuse to recognize that the Constitution has done this. Right? You young people, you are familiar with the preamble, right? The part that says, "We the people do ordain and establish this Constitution." Right? Are you familiar with Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3? Right? So if you look at Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, it sets up another class of what I call constitutional people. So the first class of constitutional people were people who were white men property owners, right? But the other class of constitutional people were the Africans who were going to be owned by them. And it's in the Constitution, right? And it says that they are to be the property of this other class, right? And that the federal government should intervene whenever necessary to protect property, including the property that people owned, right? Which was Africans as enslaved people. So you carry along a constitution like that for close to 3/4 of a century, right? And it finally, it just disintegrates. I mean, Jefferson, in a letter to John Holmes in 1820 or 1821, he says, we have the wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. So the wolf of slavery had entrapped the country, and the country couldn't hold on to it, and it couldn't safely let it go, right? And Jefferson saw that, he knew that in 1820, and 30 years later, right, it began to heat up, right? And then you get, you need to look at Taney's Supreme Court decision in 1857, which says for the first time, well, who are the constitutional people, right? So the preamble says we the people, but it doesn't say who they are, doesn't give the denotation, right, of who these people are. But Taney says, look, it's the people who came here from Europe. They are the people. And no African, free or slave, doesn't matter, can be part of that group. And so once he said that, right, the country reeled, right, into its war against, over the constitutional property of having Africans as slaves. And so it went into war, did some amending, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, did some revisions, did a lot of redemption. By 1875, right? And it's a book. I mean, it's too big to read, but it's there, right? Look at this, right? Has what? How many pages? 1,750 pages or more, right? But it's all Mississippi in 1875. Who did it? The United States Congress. The Select Committee to inquire into the Mississippi election of 1875 with testimony and documentary evidence. Whole library, right, of what went on in Mississippi in 1875. Now it's pretty simple. Basically, it was white people killing and making sure that Black people couldn't vote, but it was also Democrats killing Republicans. But of course, you don't think about, oh, those Black people are Republicans, Democrats are killing Republicans. So people could never say it that way, right? And so this little book here, right, it tells us the redemption story. I mean, Nicholas Lemon tells it in a shorter version. He has a book called Redemption. I don't know if people have read his book, but it's a really good book to read. What he says is that Grant refused to send the troops to guarantee that Black people could register to vote, not to register, could actually vote in the 1875 election. And the reason he did it was Ohio had not ratified the 15th Amendment. And so a delegation from Ohio goes to the president and says, if you send troops to Mississippi, Hayes will not be governor of Ohio. And Grant says later, well, I think I acted like the head of the party more than the president of the country. And so we got what we got, right? And then we got Hayes as president, and the deal was, because by that time, what happened in Mississippi spread across the whole South. And so you had that election and couldn't decide who was going to be president. And they made a deal. Let Hayes take the presidency. You guys kicked the troops out of the South, right? And we went into the era that led up into the civil rights movement in the 50s. That book, Circular 30, that you need to look at that Circular 3591, right?
Yeah.
Because it really kind of encapsulates what's going on in that whole era. We're not doing mass incarceration, right? What we're doing is mass subordination, right? Where young Black men primarily are rounded up for vagrancy and sent to the mines to die, basically. And the person who wrote that out, Blackman, in Slavery by Another Name, that's another book.
Douglas Blackman is a remarkable book. Yeah.
Yes, you need to really read that because he's from Mississippi. His story itself is interesting because he was born in 1964 and hit first grade in 1970, the year the Supreme Court said, well, it's been long enough, no deliberate speed, and Mississippi has to integrate its schools. His parents decided they were going to send him to the black school. So he went to school with the black kids. And he said, you know, we were there by ourselves, the white kids and the black kids, hating each other, parents not knowing anything to do about it. We were just on our own, right? And he made a strange decision when he hit the 7th grade to enter into a competition. And he wrote about Strike City. Well, Strike City happened in 1965 when sharecroppers at this plantation near Leland, where he was growing up, went on strike and left the plantation and set up a little place which they call Strike City, right? And so he wrote about it, and he was a beneficiary of, what do you call it, affirmative action, right? So they were giving one award to the black school and one award to the white school, and they assumed because he was at the black school that he was black. So he got the award, and then after he got the award, they said, well, you need to do this for the Rotary Club next year. And so he did. And there was one of the night riders who used to run by and shoot up in the Strike City camp in the audience and went after him. And all of a sudden he understood he was not looking at history. And then he got through college, Wall Street Journal job, lived in Atlanta. They sent him over to look at the Berlin Wall, and a thought struck him. What if we think about American corporations vis-a-vis, you know, black people and in the whole situation, like was thought in Germany about German corporations vis-a-vis the Jewish people. And so he went on a hunt. But he wasn't a historian. So he didn't go to, you know, the libraries and look up that. He went to the courthouses and looked up the actual records, right? And found tens and tens of thousands of young black men who have been rounded up for vagrancy by different local sheriffs and sent to jail and died, basically, right? So that's a whole nother, it's just incredible, right? But what's interesting, and I'm not sure how it's going to play itself out, is this moment that happened with Floyd George Floyd, when the country sort of saw itself for the first time. Something happened on that video. So the country recognizes itself, which it hasn't been able to do. And the question is, will that stick? And if it does, will the country do something about it?
Well, Bob, thank you for those beautiful reflections. If we can hold you for another 7 or 8 minutes, would you be willing to take a few questions?
Fine, yes, of course.
This is wonderful. So I don't know, Maddie, do you have questions that you wanted to put up, or should I just take some of the ones that you sent me?
We've got a couple of fellows in the room. If
Please.
you want to turn it over to them to ask some questions. First up, we have Ellie Morgan.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you.
It's been such an honor to hear you and Reverend Barber speak. I just have to say that first. But I'm Ellie, and I just graduated from Northwood High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. And one of the things that really inspired me to get into politics was actually Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. My dad had me read it as almost a, not a punishment for going on a walkout, but he wanted me to say whether Dr. King would approve of me going on a walkout or not.